Thank you, Lou. Good evening. In Haiti, in Creole, I would say honneur, meaning honor, and you would all respond respect. Honneur? Respect. Merci. That is the traditional way you would begin a meeting in the countryside. I prepared nothing for tonight, and I was thinking mostly to do this in the form of questions and answers. First, for me to get a feel, how many of you are here under duress? That is this an assignment for anybody, or is this everybody's here on their own? Okay, that's good. That's, I mean no offense by that, but in my day, you often had it like that. You were assigned to go to something. In the interest of getting to questions, I'll just give a very brief synopsis of Haiti's history and, I think, relevance. Many of you may know these broad outlines, but Haiti began as a French colony, actually as a Spanish colony, and then was claimed by French buccaneers. The name comes from the boucan, the fires that you would see on the Ile de la Tortue off the northern coast of Haiti, and they were called the boucaniers, and that became buccaneers. And in fact, they started to tire of the life of ambushing British ships going around the Caribbean and said, okay, let's settle down, and they started to hunt and then farm on the very fertile lands of Hispaniola, which is what Columbus named it. It was the first place he landed. In fact, one of his ships, the Santa Maria, sank there, and he built a fort on the, nobody knows quite where, but on the northern coast somewhere. That fort, the Navidad, was where he left his a contingent when he went back to Spain. When he came back, they'd been killed. They were very brutal to the Indians, and in fact, the British, the French and Spanish conquest of the region was very brutal. The Native American population of the island, the Taínos and Carib Indians, were wiped out within 13 years of the Europeans landing. And they replaced those Indians, which mostly died as slaves in gold mines and so forth, because of course gold was the prize of the day, especially for the Spanish Empire. They began importing Africans, and it became a triangle trade. They would leave from Europe, go to the west coast of Africa, pick up slaves, take them to the Caribbean, trade them, pick up rum, take them to the rum to Europe, where it was traded for guns, and then the triangle would begin again. They'd go with the guns back down and pick up slaves. That was how the colony became the richest colony in the New World. Much richer than the 13 colonies of the what would become the United States. This was the Pearl of the Antilles, it was called. And it really fueled the Industrial Revolution and the growth of France and the growth of the bourgeoisie of France, we should say, and in that sense fueled the French Revolution, which came with the watchwords liberté, égalité, fraternité. But as it turned out, many Frenchmen thought that was only true for Frenchmen and not for all men. And so a lot of the population of the island, which was indeed the engine and principal source of France's wealth at the time, began to question this. And this was happening on two levels. On the level of the slave masses, and they were about 500,000 on the island, and also on the level of a group in the country that became known as the affranchis. Now, just to step back for a minute, the French came with what was called the Code Noir, the Black Code, which divided things racially. The whites, mulattoes, which were a cross of African and European. In fact, the term itself is a little pejorative because mulatto means mule, means it can't reproduce. A mule, of course, being a cross between a horse and a donkey. So even the term mulatto is a little pejorative. And then the Africans. But in fact, it was quite a bit more complex than that because there were, in the end, stratas within all those racial groups, the racial groups really being something artificial imposed by the French. Among the whites, you had the owners of the plantations, who often weren't in the colony of Saint-Domingue itself. They were often back in Bordeaux and France. And they would just have managers really running the plantations. And then there were a host of much smaller people, many of whom were in fact slaves themselves, indentured servants and so forth, who of Europeans who worked as cobblers and blacksmiths and did a lot of the other intermediary chores of the colony. Then there was, in the mulattoes, a division between, there were those who were slaves still, but there were many who were freed, because often when a European master would have a child with a slave mother, he would give the child his or her independence. And in fact, many slaves were in fact freed after a certain number of years or service. And so there began to grow a class of the affranchis. And this meant the freed men of sorts. And many of them became very wealthy. They often inherited property and had slaves themselves. But what they found was even if they had only a quarter or an eighth or a 16th or a 32nd or a 64th African blood, and it was broken down just like that with a name for each percentage, they could not be fully Frenchmen. And they began to send delegations to France, to Paris, especially when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, to say, hey, you know, you're saying égalité, let's see it. And they were often sent back and then killed. And this was where they began to have trouble. At the same time, the masses of slaves were also questioning these slogans that were coming out of the French Revolution. And to make a long story short, a revolution erupted in 1791 in August after slaves on the northern plain, which was the richest part of the colony, banded together, had a pact of sorts, and organized a rebellion, which left the skies darkened and the nights reddened with fire for about a week or two. And they massacred the slave drivers, the plantation owners, and essentially started what would become a 13-year revolutionary process. In the course of that, leaders emerged. Most of them were from the affranchis, people like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, Alexandre Pétion. And the history of the revolution is extremely complex. You can read about it in The Black Jacobins, which I see Walter Duhamel has on display in the library. And there's also another, this is a real classic of historical writing, very, very moving, written by a guy called C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian Trotskyist in the 1930s. He was a real believer in Toussaint Louverture in particular. And there was another book that came out a few years ago called Avengers of the New World. And it's done by a guy called Laurent Dubois. And this is also an extremely instructive and approaches it from a little more of a class analysis, class perspective. In short, that revolution was the polar opposite, we could say, of our own revolution in the United States. This was a nation founded by slave owners. Haiti's, which was the second independent nation in Latin America, was founded by slaves, which makes it, in a sense, its whole, I could say, historical DNA very different from this country's. It always struck me as interesting that when people would refer to Barack Obama, for instance, he's a black man. That's in the United States. In Haiti, he would be considered a white man because he's half white. So it's this sort of different approach to the world, to life, that makes these countries, in a sense, polar opposites. In any case, that revolution in Haiti, in a sense, was the touchstone for the revolutions that swept Latin America. Miranda, the great revolutionary leader of the South American continent, met with Dessalines and received military support from him in his fight against Spanish colonialism. And then his successor, Bolivar, who succeeded in liberating much of the northern part of South America, met with Pétion and got guns and printing presses and all sorts of support from the Haitians to carry out their anti-colonial struggles. And in fact, if you look at the flags of Ecuador, Colombia, and other countries, you'll see the Haitian flag is in it. You'll see the red and blue. That's the Haitian flag, and the yellow is what distinguishes it. Ironically, Haiti became a pariah, even of the newly freed Latin American countries. It was a few years later at a conference of those nations was not invited. But its birth was very difficult. In 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared Haiti's independence. And it wasn't until 1862, in the midst of the Civil War in this country, that the United States recognized Haiti. France sent its entire Atlantic fleet to Haiti in 1825 and demanded reparations. It's one of the few cases where the defeated army demanded reparations from the victor. And this was because the slave-owning colonialist powers of the day had the power to tell this upstart nation that you are going to pay for your liberation of your people.